it's a way of thinking that I'm shocked to see acquiring this kind of influence. And I'm going to go in a delicate place here. About 15 years ago, I was talking to a Black reporter, and we were having the typical disagreement as to whether or not racism is as decisive a factor as we're often told. And she wasn't a fierce kind of person, but she clearly did not like me. You know, she was being very polite about it, but she didn't like the kind of person who I am as a Black person who doesn't agree with the sorts of views she had. Very pacific kind of person. And so we were exchanging ideas without it getting nasty before we were recording. And she said, so for example, in my neighborhood, you can just see the racism. And what she was referring to is that in her neighborhood, which is largely a somewhat depressed neighborhood, there is an elite school that you have to take a serious test to get into. And so in that off neighborhood, you see white and South Asian and Asian kids streaming into the doors in a neighborhood that otherwise is full of Black and Latino kids. Now she looks at that and she says, you can just see the racism. How come none of the kids from the neighborhood are going to that school? Who are all these kids from other neighborhoods going there instead? Now, I remember her saying that, and I remember thinking, okay, this is the problem. It was a little earlier in my development. It's probably like '08. I thought a person like her sees something like that and is applying a rather stringent standard. And I was wrapping my head around it. And I was really thinking, is she right? If you see something like that, it's racism, because the way it's supposed to be is that that neighborhood is full of the kids who live next door to that building, not these people who come from other neighborhoods. Why aren't there as many Black and brown kids there as is represented in the population of New York? If there isn't, then the reason is something called racism. And I couldn't help thinking, wow, if you look at that and you just knit your brow and say it's bigotry or some outgrowth of it, that there's something about the society not being fair to Black and brown people, that's the only explanation for why all those Jewish and Asian kids are walking around there. And you look at that and you think racism. And racism to you is a word that hits you in the same place as it would if you were thinking about a white person stepping on a Black person's toe. The use of that word there is a modern American peculiarity, but we're stuck with it. Racist. I thought, this is what I mean by delicate. I thought at the time, I don't find that very insightful. I thought, I'm not sure that she is inclined to think about this a little harder. And I don't mean that she's dumb. I think that she just had learned to think that way about race and just kind of kept going. Because the reason that the Black kids aren't going to that school is so many things. The reasons are so many things. It has to do with the history, the racist history of the United States, definitely. But it also has to do with, I hate to say, because of that racist history, certain cultural attitudes that Black people often don't have that get you into schools like that. There's a whole notion that high class nerdiness is something other than being Black. And it's been authoritatively documented. That's a factor in the culture. It's not a matter of blame. It's just something that happened as the result of the racist past for reasons that we can get into. But there are all sorts of reasons why the people in that neighborhood aren't going to that particular school, especially since the schools that those people go to in the neighborhood are run by Black and brown people. It's not as if white people in those schools have been holding them down for generations, treating them as lesser beings. It's complicated. And yet this reporter is just looking there and thinking it's racism. Now, that was just her then. And I remember thinking, this is something you get from often educated people, often people in the media. And thankfully, it doesn't go too far beyond that. We're now stuck in a situation where people are running schools who think that way. So their idea is if you have any kind of imbalance of that kind, then draconian measures are necessary to get rid of that white supremacy. And what worries me in particular is that one way that we want to get rid of it now, apparently, is by excusing Black kids from what are called white standards, such as being precise and being on time and being objective and prizing the written word. And I genuinely want to know, I'm done, genuinely want to know, to what extent are these supposed anti-racists actually teaching Black kids that they don't have to be on time, so to speak, in all of those ways? Is that something that's just being said to placate a certain kind of Black person who enjoys hearing it? Or are Black kids really being excused from getting the right answers? I don't have the answer to that question now. I know what these people say in their documents, but I'd be open to finding out that never infects these curricula. But the gauntlet is upon them, because from their writings, I get the feeling that the way we're going to get rid of this racism is to make sure that Black kids don't have to try very hard. And I find that disgusting. And if they don't even feel the need to defend it, I find them disgusting.